One of the ways that you can know you're having an addicted experience in sexuality is how you respond when your partner, your spouse says no. If I'm moving towards my wife sexually and she is not interested, she says no, it would make sense that I feel disappointed. I may feel sad about that. It doesn't make sense if I'm angry, if I'm enraged, because that's telling me that there's something else that's going on here. And so I often say I can feel sad about not being sexual. The rage and the anger comes when someone's telling me no about my drug. Mm-hmm. And so there might have been this additional agenda that I had from the sexual experience. If saying no generates fear, if someone isn't interested and now I'm afraid of something, that again is telling me that I'm not in that place of intimacy and connection, but I have this additional agenda. If someone isn't interested in being sexual and I make it about me and I personalize it, that can create the chaos that keeps me from being able to get to the truth of what is going on.
Welcome to the Faithful and True podcast. Happy to be back with you today with Dr. Greg Miller and Chris and Elizabeth Hardesty from the staff here at Faithful and True. And we're here to continue a conversation that we started on our last podcast in which we were talking about addictive sex in marriage. And we kind of opened that can of worms and decided that there's a lot of additional content to unearth, as long as I'm talking about worms.
Right. Continuing the metaphor.
Exactly right. So, Elizabeth, Chris, welcome back.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, and I think probably a good place to start is, again, just defining addicted sex in marriage, because for a lot of people it's not a concept that they've defined, though they probably may have experienced it. And really it is that sexual experience where for whatever reason, for a variety of different reasons, I'm unable to be fully present in the experience with my spouse. And so therefore, there can be this additional agenda, there can be a lack of presence, there can be a sense of loss even in the experience, because I think there's a part of us that intuitively knows that something is missing when we're not fully experiencing what God intended sex to be. Mm-hmm. Is there anything else that y'all would add as far as we kind of launch and continue the conversation?
Yeah, I think you talked about this a little bit in the first one, but how just our belief here is that, sex comes out of an expression. It's an expression of that full spiritual and emotional connection. I think you talked about being fully known and fully safe. Mm-hmm. And so I think there's just this sense of something's not there. This isn't that full expression, right? There is a different agenda that's behind it.
Right.
It's almost like sex is being used versus being experienced. Mm-hmm. It's kind of how I see it.
Right.
It's a tool for something, that I can't achieve otherwise.
Right. Well, one of the things that I think is significant as we're trying to identify, kind of the question is, how do I know if I'm having addicted sex in marriage, or what may be the indicators that we're not fully experiencing what God intended? And I would start with this idea that there is a sacredness to the sexual experience, that a significant part of who we are sexually is who we are spiritually. God is the one that created us sexually, and so therefore to connect with my spouse sexually is also to connect with God and the divine. And so that can show up in a variety of ways, but maybe to be able to understand it is a holy experience. Mm-hmm. And there's a beauty that comes from the sacredness of it. And so if I leave the experience and it's been a performance, that's one of the things that I often talk to men about. If my question at the end of the sexual experience is, how did I do? Well, suddenly I've turned it into a performance that can be evaluated versus, Chris, the word you used, an experience that I can be present in. So, we're taught so much about performing, and whether it's at work or in other parts of our life, even in our faith, we know how to have a performance-based faith. Well, it makes sense that translates to our sexual experience where we're evaluating it based upon our partner's response or how we evaluate how we feel like we did in the experience, and that's going to rob us of the sacredness that I think God intended.
Experience.
And we were talking too about like culture and how, I mean, basically it seems to me that everything we see in culture generally would fall in this category of addicted sex and marriage, if you will, addicted sex and marriage. But, think about in Hollywood, the sexual experiences we might see in Hollywood, none of that is experiencing the sacredness of the sexual experience. It's just, again, it's a tool. It's just actually just being used as something for self gratification or what have you. I mean, that's what we see. So it makes sense that this would be new territory for people.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, one of the things that can be true is if I'm not present in the sexual experience, I become a voyeur of my own sexual experience. I become an observer rather than engaging and experiencing it myself. So if you feel removed, and one of the things I want to validate is for anyone who has experienced sexual abuse or sexual violence, that's a part of my story, the sexual abuse, part of the coping strategy is the ability to detach and disassociate from the experience. And so if that's one of your coping strategies, you're going to need some help and support to re-engage and be present in the experience, because that detachment was the way that you created safety. I know for a lot of people, as soon as the energy starts moving towards sexuality, as soon as there's a touch, as soon as there's a feeling, they can immediately start removing themselves. And so I also want to say, for those who are listening, that they do remove themselves in order to be safe. This isn't about shame. It's not that there's something wrong with you. I often say if we didn't have those coping strategies, we wouldn't have been able to survive. And yet, as wise adults, we can come back and begin to heal and to create safety by being present versus by removing ourselves from the experience.
Pay attention to what our body's telling us, what our emotions are telling us of what we need to heal, right? To find that foundation of safety so we can stay fully present and integrated. And whatever that journey looks like, it may be a process there. Yeah.
One thing I would say, we were just talking about, one of the ways that you can know you're having an addicted experience in sexuality is how you respond when your partner, your spouse says no. And so if I'm moving towards someone sexually, if I'm moving towards my wife sexually and she is not interested, she says no, it would make sense that I feel disappointed. I may feel sad about that. It doesn't make sense if I'm angry, if I'm enraged, because that's telling me that there's something else that's going on here. And so I often say I can feel sad about not being sexual. The rage and the anger comes when someone's telling me no about my drug. And so there might have been this additional agenda that I had from the sexual experience. If saying no generates fear, if someone isn't interested and now I'm afraid of something, that again is telling me that I'm not in that place of intimacy and connection, but I have this additional agenda. If someone isn't interested in being sexual and I make it about me and I personalize it, that can create the chaos that keeps me from being able to get to the truth of what is going on.
Yeah, I think of that anger side of that, and also then the personalizing it in terms of the weight that I might feel in terms of a rejection from the other person. So just being able to just recognize that they're legitimately not interested. If we're in a good place and they're legitimately not interested in being sexual right now, or they can't be, or what have you, nothing punitive going on here, and it certainly isn't it's not an indictment on who I am. It's not a rejection. It just is for now, and that's okay. But I think it can fall. For a lot of guys that I work with anyway, I think it can fall squarely on that. There's so much of their identity that they put in this being sexual for one, and then when they're turned down or when they're told we can't be sexual right now, then it falls squarely on this idea of them being rejected.
What are the messages around that?
Yeah.
I think along the same lines, I often encourage women I work with to slow down and pay attention to, okay, like what is my motivation behind this? So if a woman, for example, or a man is moving towards wanting to be sexual, to even just check in with yourself of why, where is this coming from? Is this, am I feeling anxious about what's going on over there? And so this is the way I want to try to manage that anxiety or kind of control the situation. Or am I feeling inadequate or insecure, and so I want to be sexual in order to feel that I'm enough? Or is this coming from a place where I do feel safe, I do feel connected, and I do want to have this experience? So I think on the front end too, slowing down and checking in with what's behind this, what's driving this desire.
Well, one of the things that in a lot of relationships, we can begin to use sexuality as a way to get reassurance. And so I'm wanting the sexual experience with my spouse to reassure me that I'm okay, that I'm acceptable, I'm includable, I'm choosable. And then couples can also use it as a reassurance that their coupleship is okay. As long as we're being sexual, we're okay, we're in a good place. And it actually can become a distraction from working on some of the issues. It becomes a way to just kind of cover it up versus recognizing there are some things that we need to work on in our relationship, and being sexual doesn't necessarily resolve that. One of the things I believe is that sexuality cannot create intimacy. It simply validates and expresses the intimacy that is already there. And yet many of us were taught, or we learned, or we were exposed to this idea that if you want to be intimate with someone, you are sexual with them. Versus, I am intimate in my marriage, therefore we're going to express sexuality out of that intimacy. But the intimacy comes first.
And the word intimate is often used around here as not by the staff, but often by clients. We often hear them say, "Well, we were intimate with one another," as a synonym or a descriptor for being sexual.
We had sex.
Yeah, right. And so there's some work to do there as well in terms of just understanding that full scope of intimacy.
One thing we learned early on is kind of this phrase of from the living room to the bedroom. You know, like kind of what's happening outside, like what's happening in our communication, what's happening in terms of feeling safe emotionally, physically. How are we talking about hard things? I mean, just what level of intimacy is there, you know, going on in our day-to-day life, and then being able to move to the bedroom and have that expression there.
One of the things that is true about sexuality and the way that God created it is there's an intention for there to be a playfulness. Yes, sometimes there's a deep intimacy and seriousness, and there's a beauty in that, and there can also be a playfulness. It can be a place of having fun and connecting in that way. And one of the things that we need to recognize is fun is an expression of intimacy. When I allow myself to be in that fun, playful space, I am being vulnerable. And if I'm being vulnerable, then that creates the space for intimacy. And again, kind of the pattern is, in order for there to be intimacy, there needs to be vulnerability. And in order for there to be vulnerability, there needs to be safety. Yes. So what am I doing in my relationship that contributes to safety so that then we can express ourselves sexually at some point in the context of our relationship? One of the things that can be challenging is, we talked about this in the last podcast, sometimes there are legitimate seasons, there's reasons why couples are unable to fully express themselves sexually. It could be a health issue, it could be a relational issue, it could be just the recognition of the significance and the chaos that the addiction has created. And one of the things that couples have to identify is who are we, and what does it mean for our relationship if for a season sexuality is taken out of it, especially if it was the primary or exclusive way that we tried to create intimacy. Well, if that's the exclusive way that we create intimacy and now it's no longer available, that begins to expose some things about our relationship that can be pretty disorienting for a couple.
Very overwhelming. Can feel very scary at first of what do we put in that place? What does it really look like to connect in other ways? And how do we work on that foundation of emotional and spiritual intimacy? Can feel pretty scary and overwhelming at first.
Well, and for the men that come to our workshop, one of the things that we will talk about is a 90-day abstinence, where if there has been an addiction, we want to create a season of detox, and we think it's a helpful and healthy time to recalibrate. And part of that 90 days is if we're going to bring something out, we need to put something back in. And we always encourage the couple to identify what's another expression of intimacy, another way to connect that we can begin to be intentional about for these 90 days if we're not going to choose to be sexual.
Yeah, we've seen some pretty strong reactions to the idea of abstinence, not just from men, but also from couples even. So we see that in our couples work sometimes as well. Like the couple is maybe deathly afraid of not being a period of time of not being sexual because of what that represents to them in the relationship. And so finding other ways to be intimate or to find intimacy beyond being sexual, for a lot of folks, many folks, it's a foreign concept.
Well, and for a lot of couples, I mentioned in the last podcast that the way that God created sexuality, it's a holistic experience. It involves all of who we are. So it's who we are emotionally, spiritually, mentally, physically, relationally, and then also sexually. Well, the physical part of it is what comes online first and is very powerful. And so once couples start experiencing the physical connection, it's very easy for that to supersede and overtake all the other areas. And so if we're not careful, we've reduced sexuality just to be physical. And so for a lot of couples, their history would indicate being physically sexual was one of the ways that we've created connection over the years. And if we're asking them to consider taking that out for a season, that does get pretty scary because it's kind of threatening maybe the foundation of connection that the couple has had from the very beginning. And so it is that ability to say, okay, there are other ways to connect, and we want to encourage you to find new ways to create intimacy and set this aside for a season, because I think what we know on the backside is if I can create intimacy in other ways apart from sexuality, when I bring sexuality back into our coupleship, then what happens is then it becomes an expression of the intimacy that is already there.
Right. I think one thing I'm just becoming aware of is, and just want to take a minute to address, because the women I work with, is there can be an incredible amount of grief and loss in this area. And I just want to validate that and take a minute where we don't just brush past this and say, okay, we'll just sober for 90 days. And there's significant grieving, I think, in what maybe some of what she thought sexuality was going to be in the relationship, or thought that it was, and then realizing how maybe she has been used or it hasn't been a safe experience. And so I think just acknowledging whatever feelings come up in that, whether it's anger or loss or sadness or frustration, like those feelings are valid. I think I can hold the hope that there is a way through this. There is healthy sexuality, it's healthy expression, but those feelings of loss and grief at first are very valid.
Right. One thing that would probably be helpful to address also is after there's been the explosion or the information has been shared, a wife now knows about the sexual acting out. For some women, there can be a temptation to rush back to sexuality too quickly.
Yeah.
Maybe because they feel like that's their responsibility. Maybe they believe that they are responsible for the addiction, and if they were just sexual more, that they could control, their husband's addiction. What's true, though, is if I move toward sexuality without establishing safety first, then that will eventually become a sense of violation to myself. Anytime I push myself past my limits and I step into a space that isn't safe just for the sake of somebody else or some other agenda, I'm violating my own sense of safety, and that's going to eventually be very disruptive. And we kind of see working with couples where the information is shared, there's that full disclosure, or they now know what has been going on. And after that, there can be a season of what appears to be really significant intimacy for a couple, because for the first time, the wife does know about the husband, feels like there is a sense of connection. The husband is feeling free of this information. And a lot of times there will be couples who kind of find sex as a way to connect during the season of vulnerability. And at some point, it's our experience that a wife begins to realize that she needs to take a step back from it. And so I'll be talking to a man that will say, I don't know what happened. For the first 2 months of my recovery, we were sexual and it was great. And now all of a sudden she seems distant or disinterested. And I just want to validate all that makes sense, that she's needing some space to really deal with the hurt and the grief and the pain. And the best thing you can do is simply support and validate that makes sense given what I've done, that you would be experiencing that, and that sex is complicated right now, and you may not have a desire to be sexual with me because of what I've done.
And I think even to have the hope of those experiences right away, right? Like to give themselves permission to step back from that and take the time they need to heal, and to not beat themselves up for experiencing that, because it sounds, I mean, that can be like a glimmer of something to come.
Right,
that,
exactly.
You know, that's a taste, but let's not rush it. Let's get that foundation there of really having that safety, that intimacy in other ways, so that can become an expression that you both can really lean into.
I know that you and Beth and I did a podcast a while back on things that women did that were helpful in the early recovery and things that women did that weren't helpful. And I think that one of the things on the list was, for some women, they do grieve the fact that they move towards sexuality too quick. And if that's your situation, if that's what happened in your coupleship, I love that idea of have grace with yourself.
Yes.
Instead of it being about shame or regret, it can simply be about the fact that you were doing the best that you could, that was true for you in that moment, and then things began to awaken in you that you realized this isn't the best choice for me. And I would say to the men, if your wife is taking a step back from sexuality, the best thing that you can do is support her and validate her in that decision versus trying to manipulate her back or shame her back into being sexual with you again.
Which would be another indicator, probably, of that addictive energy is still happening in the relationship.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a huge relief, sense of safety and trust when a husband is patient. When he knows, like, okay, like, this is a roller coaster. You know, there are some times where maybe she is there, she is feeling safe, and then the next day she needs to take some steps back. And I think just the patience and understanding along that, and the gentleness for her with herself in that is huge.
And I think it can go the other way too. I think an indicator that maybe he's coming out of the addictive place of sexuality and sex and marriage is that, you know, he recognizes his limits as well, and he recognizes that they're communicating about this, but there may be times when he's not available. It's not punitive or anything like that. That's not what we're talking about, but he's legitimately not available. He's too tired, or he knows he can't be present, he knows he can't be. He knows he can't invest in that holistic experience with his spouse, and so for himself and also for her, he says, you know, I need to take a rain check on that for now, and that's okay. And I think that's a sign that a guy is coming out of that addictive place.
Well, I said in the last podcast, one of the things about healthy sexuality is everybody gets their yes and everybody gets their no, and that's even in the context of moving towards sexuality. So if there's an agreement to be sexual and we're moving towards that, and then someone gets something triggered or becomes aware of something, even in the context of moving towards sexuality, somebody still gets their no. To be able to say, I'm not in that space, I'm sorry, I thought that I was, or I'm feeling really anxious or fearful now. I just want to name that. What's interesting is anytime we show up with our truth in our coupleship, that is creating intimacy. So there is an intimacy in saying, I'm not able to move forward with this. There's an intimacy in saying, I'm feeling really anxious right now. There's an intimacy in saying, what if we give this a try? Maybe it will work, maybe it won't, but I'm willing to move forward to the extent that I can. But anytime we show up with what is true for us, that is creating intimacy. You talked about this idea of hope, and in the end of this podcast, or as we conclude the podcast, I want to just offer that message of hope, that even where there's been significant betrayal, even when there's been significant injury, either before or during the marriage, we have seen and we do believe and we have experienced the transformation that can come around the area of sexuality when we take a step back and look at the fullness of what it was that God intended. And instead of living in this very narrow, small definition, that we're able to see that it truly is this sacred experience of connecting and being present, being known, being safe, being connected and vulnerable in the context of our sexuality.
Couldn't agree more. I mean, I just think that there's so much opportunity. I like to frame it as an opportunity. Often I frame recovery individually and as a couple as an opportunity. And there's such an opportunity here to lean into what God intended sexuality to be for us as individuals and as a couple. And having been on one side, and now maybe at least I don't know that we've ever fully arrived, but moving towards that other side of just really catching that vision of what healthy sexuality, godly healthy sexuality really looks like, and experiencing that. It's just second to none. It's just wonderful.
Mm-hmm.
I would just say, though, for those listening, be gentle. I keep saying that, but be gentle with where you are, because this is a journey, and I think it's one step at a time. Talking to people, getting some help. I know for us, being able to talk with Mark and Debbie about this, and talk for myself individually, what was going on for me, talk to my groups, just not do this alone, I think is huge. But just being gentle with where you are in the midst of this is big.
Well, one of the things that is true is what creates chaos in the area of sexuality for us can be the pain that we've experienced around it, both in our marriage and prior to our marriage. And so in order for there to be connection, there must be healing. And we often want there to be a bypass, or we want there to be a shortcut. And in the area of transformation and healing, there really isn't. I often say you have to move towards, you have to move through, you have to move beyond. And that's especially true when we're wanting to heal in the area of sexuality. Those parts of my story, those experiences that create the most shame, the most pain, are the ones that I want to avoid the most, and yet those are the ones that have the most control over me. So I have to have the courage to engage my own story, and when it is safe, to invite my spouse to be in that space too. And what I would say is, when your spouse invites you into the sacredness of the pain of their sexuality, that you are on holy ground. This is the take your shoes off kind of moment, holy ground, because they are being vulnerable in a way that can be truly healing and sacred in that space. And we encourage couples, if there's some additional resources that you need. There are some great books around healthy sexuality from a Christian perspective. There are Christian sex therapists. And the more pain, the more chaos, the more hurt and injury there's been, it makes perfect sense the more intentional resources and focus you're going to need to experience healing.
Yes. And there is hope.
And there is
hope.
So
we'll come back with more podcasts around that.
That's our theme, for sure.
Well,
For sure.
and I do want, for the couples that are listening to us that have had a history of just painful, hurtful, disappointing experiences in sexuality, we want to offer hope. There is a way forward when both persons are committed to being safe, both persons are being committed to being vulnerable and intentional and committed, and in that space, there is hope.
Well, Chris and Elizabeth, thanks so much for joining us again today
pleasure.
on the Faithful and True podcast. Greg, as always, your contract has been renewed, and we look forward to seeing you.
Canceled.
You have not been canceled. In today's culture, that's a big deal that you're not being canceled. So thanks to everybody for your participation today. We hope that our audience has enjoyed today's podcast, and if you are hearing these conversations, these discussions, and it's opening your eyes to some situations in your life that you'd like to look deeper into or look for help, please visit faithfulandtrue.com, where there's lots of resources. There's over 400 of these podcasts, and we also have blogs. We have our bookstore, and just many great opportunities to expand your understanding of the situation. We also offer the Men of Valor. Boy, there's a flashback.
Yeah.
Yes. Well, you can earmark this for editing. Edit that out. Cut that right out. The Men's Journey Workshop, which we offer every month here at Faithful and True. We offer the Women's Journey Workshop. We have that coming up again soon. And then we also have a workshop for couples. All those details are on faithfulandtrue.com. Until next time, we hope that this coming week for you will be a week that's filled with many blessings and with great vision.